I'm Fabio Lanza. I teach both in the Department of History and the Department of East Asian Studies. I am a modern China historian, and I work. My work has been entirely on the 20th century, and I work on student movement, political activism originally, global Maoism, influence of China, and I'm currently working on a book on the late 1950s and transformation of everyday life through collectivization in the city of Beijing and problems of gender, political economy, and things like that. But my main interest is the history of politics, and especially the history right now of Maoist politics, so socialist China. But for this talk, I decided to do something different, in part because I am constantly enraged every day by reading the news, and by reading the news about China, especially how the discourse on China has shifted and changed in the recent years in this country, and not just in this country, I would say in the entire Western world, and how dangerous sort of that is. I'm also a member of a group called the Critical China Scholars, who is basically trying to do, if you want, the widespread education about China, about the problems with China, about the US-China policy and things like that. So I think that fits. And I think also it speaks to contemporary concern. Let me share my screen so I can do this. Here it is. So let me start with this picture. I don't know if you know this picture, but this is the trial of Donald Trump during the recent impeachment. One of his lawyer, one of these very weird lawyers, I think his name is Dave Sean or Shore, I forgot his name, at a certain point took off his pocket a copy of the Chairman Mao Zedong Little Red Book, and as a prop, and basically used it to argue that whatever the impeachment was basically a communist plot of some form. Don't ask me the logic about this; it's just completely bizarre. But the easiness with which even in this particular case one could make reference to something Chinese, and China in particular, as communist, ominous, and the source of all possible conspiracy is alarming. It's specifically alarming, I think, because it's part. This is the most ridiculous, I think, and absolutely the most ridiculous examples of a larger discourse that's becoming very predominant especially in the media. But not just in the media, I think in all Washington circles, think tanks from the left to the right. And it's a discourse of the new Cold War. The assessment is that there is a new Cold War with China, or that the new Cold War is coming. I'll give you some example. Sorry. This is from, I think, Foreign Affairs, an investigation took place against Beijing. This is from the Brookings Institution. The US-China Cold War has already started, and these are, relatively mainstream, I would say, publication. I mean, not lefty, but mainstream. If you want to the right wing, completely to the right wing, you have the historian Neil Ferguson, right-wing historian Neil Ferguson. The nuclear war with China that's already begun, or Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, extremely right-wing, that announces a bill to tour the Communist Party responsible for COVID-19. So there is this sort of like, it's clear. I mean, even to recently, I don't know. But even recently, this is not just a Trump administration thing. The Trump administration sort of ratcheted up the rhetoric against China, talking about the trade war and the China virus, the Wuhan flu, or whatever they call. the Kung Flu, but also this is I think an attitude that's now shared by all parts of the political spectrum. Think there are left-leaning or less democratic-leaning think tank in Washington. They're basically projecting the same thing. During the presidential debate, Biden chided Trump, saying that he wrote the art of the deal, but the Chinese perpetrated the art of the steal. And just recently, President Biden spoke at a Munich Security Conference and framed the future debate in the world as one between authoritarianism and democracies, and place the old communist enemy, Russia and China, on the side of the authoritarians, which they might be, but I don't think that's a particularly useful framework. So I'm just saying this because I find that the rhetoric of the new Cold War extremely dangerous. So what I'm going to try to do here briefly, at least try to do, is try to sort of give you a bit of historical background of where this rhetoric comes from, and also try to tell you something about at least some of the hotspots in which this rhetoric focuses on, in particular in relationship to China. So I'll give you just a brief outline of the history of the post-war history of US-China relationship, and especially of US discourse on China. And then, if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about one of these hotspots, which is Hong Kong. But there are, of course, other Xinjiang, especially right now, the northwestern province with the persecution of the Uyghurs, and Taiwan and Tibet and others. But I want to sort of make it so that this discourse of the Cold War is not naturalized, but actually it is perceived with all the dangerous and often racist implication that it has. So let me start with the sort of a brief overview of the history of the U.S. discourse on China in the last, since World War II. So at the end of World War II in 1945, China moved from a war of resistance against Japan to a civil war. In which the Communist Party and the communist side resulted victorious, leading to the founding of the current state, the People's Republic of China, and the fleeing of the Nationalist Party, the other side, to Taiwan to constitute the Republic of China, or to continue the existence, if you want, of the Republic of China. And that's why you have the two Chinas. The 1949 victory of the communists left many in the U.S., especially in the U.S., defense and diplomacy, flabbergasted. And there was a lot of debate at the time in 1949 about the so-called loss of China, as if China were the American to lose, it's not usually very well known, but the beginning of the Red Purges under Senator McCarthy and the persecution of the communists in the US started specifically with an attack to the people who supposedly lost China, or the people who were supposed to have not done well enough because they were sympathetic to the cause of the communists. And one of the first victims of the purges was Owen Latimer, which you see here in a picture, and in the next picture is actually next to McCarthy, who was accused of being a communist sympathizer, who was accused to have sort of, misinformed the US, while probably simply he told, as many others did, that the communists were going to win and that it was better to strike a relationship with them than support the other side. Latimer lost his job, was forced to eventually move to England. The Institute of Pacific Relationship that he had started, which was this sort of transnational organization that they could devoted to the study of Asia, was disbanded and closed. And it is the first salvo of what the McCarthy era represented for Asian studies, which was a massive persecution. It's a weird thing, but in this country, the creation of the field of Asian study, which is prosperous, started after World War II in large part, with massive investment from the government, which needed to sort of fund people that knew the enemy, China, and the ex-enemy, which was Japan, and Korea, of course. But so there was a massive investment, but at the same time that there was this massive investment, there was also massive persecution, so that by the end of the 1950s or by the mid-1950s, Asia expertise in the US was either clamped down, erased, or silenced. You have an entire generation of Asian scholars, people who knew Asia, or people who knew China, people who had experience in the countries, in all these countries, who knew the languages, that have learned by direct experience or indirect experience to shut up, to be silent, to not criticize the government, to not go against the government, and actually, in some cases, that it was much better to collaborate with the government. And so one of the things that you see in the following decades, especially at the time of Vietnam and the Vietnam War comes, is that the Asians, the expertise in Asian studies largely silenced or cooperative with the government, even when the government is doing things that don't make much sense if you know the region a little bit. And actually, the reaction to government policy, especially to the Vietnam War, comes from a much younger generation that has not gone through the persecution of McCarthy. Now, at the time, so throughout the 50s and especially the 60s, the framing of how we understood, especially China, but also other places, was framed through one particular branch of one particular ideology that framed the social sciences at the time, which was called modernization theory at the time, which is an idea that has nothing to do with China to start with, but that started in the social scientists. And that basically, I'm simplifying, so just bear with me, that basically describe a normal path of development for society and nation. And the normal path of development was the path that led to a society similar to that of the United States, which modernization theorists argue had reached the perfect, not the perfect, but the highest level possible for a society at the time. It was described as a society of consensus, where problems, social problems were not resolved through, violence or direct confrontation, but through a shared, agreement and exactly enrichment of the consensus. At the time, they very, very sneakily remove any reference to race issue and Black liberation or anything like that. But there was the idea. There was a normal path of development. Other paths of development, like those proposed by the communists, for example, the Soviet Union and others, were inherently non-normal. They were pathological, and they were, like a disease, they had to be prevented because they risk spreading. So one of the problems was that the US had to prevent other countries to follow the pathological path that, for example, Maoism proposed. And that led into, again, intervention in Asia, intervention in Vietnam, intervention in Korea, in Indonesia, and all these other places. Now, in this particular perspective, what the Maoists were doing in China, it's not even strange or bad, it's completely irrational. It's described as something that doesn't make any sense. It's illogic, it's a perversion, it's pathological. So there's nothing to understand about what China is doing. It's just completely crazy. And as I say, that craziness could spread. That was part of the domino theory idea that, if you let the Chinese do what they do, oh my God, this completely insanity could actually spread. So again, there was nothing to understand. So if you read books written at the time, books written in the 60s and the 50s, especially by the social science at the time, they describe, there are books about the thwarted psychology of the Chinese, who needs a charismatic figure, and therefore they follow this strange pathological, the rule of development. So there's complex explanation to describe the Chinese and the Maoists, the Mao model, as completely irrational aliens, something that didn't make any sense, except unless in the form of psychological disease. Now, this is the story up until 1976 or the end of the 70s. 1976, Mao Zedong died, the Cultural Revolution ends, and by 1978, a new guy is in charge, is the guy that Deng Xiaoping, the guy that starts the reform, the so-called reform era, of which we see the fruits today. By the 1980s, when the reform era, which is a series of market-based, capitalist-based economic reform and the opening of the country to foreign investment, by that time, by the 1980s, the discourse on China shifts, because China is not the land of craziness anymore, or at least not just the land of craziness. It's not anymore in that irrational path, but a switch path. And the path is described as a path of approaching us, becoming like us. So that if you read the description of the time, there are all provision about how long it will take for China to evolve to the point that they become like us. Another social scientist says, it's the path of becoming sameness, becoming exactly all the same. By the way, this is a process that it's never ending, because China is always perceived to be lacking something. So they're never there, because they can never really reach there. But they're moving towards us. And this discourse basically, I think, will last through the 80s and the 90s. The 90s are the massive sort of explosion of Chinese economy with a growth rate of 10, 12% per year, massive, rapid enrichment, rapid increase of wealth overall of the country. There is a moment in the middle that sort of represent a little bit of a crisis of this model, and it's 1989 when student and workers protest in Beijing, but also in other cities, gets sort of bloodily repressed by intervention of the army, and people get killed and arrested and so on and so forth. And that's seen as sort of, oh my God, we're wrong. China is actually not becoming like us. But eventually, even that moment is sort of reinserted into the logic of becoming like us, because it's seen all the students that were protesting are just sort of the heralds of the futures to come. They just calling for democracy, since the country is not yet ready. So that's I would say, I'm simplifying, but that's pretty much the discourse that dominates in the Western world, in the US specifically, but I would say in the Western world in general, the description of what China is doing. Capitalist reform will lead eventually to transformation of China in a country like any other country, meaning a capitalist liberal democracy of sort. In 2001, after September 11, I want to highlight this, even if it's not a rapid change, when the President George W. Bush launches the so-called war on terror, China does not oppose the war on terror. Actually, China joins the war on terror happily. And it joins with the proviso that that allows them to do what they want, to apply the same sort of tactics and strategy of the war on terror to their own terrorists. And by that, they refer specifically to people in contested provinces like Xinjiang, and especially the Muslim Uyghurs. And if you have time, we'll talk about them. If not, just keep it in mind. Things start changing radically after 2008 and 2009. 2008, it's the as you know, the world financial crisis, which affects China as well. China has an immediate response and is spending way more money than the US did, for example, investing way more money with the sort of rescue package. But the 2008-2009 crisis sort of, if you look at it in the long term, if you look at it from today, sort of reveals that they reveal the crisis of capitalism, that global capitalism is prone to devastating crisis, and that you risk collapse. You risk collapse even in China, which is you think might be separated, but it's not. That it reveals the interconnection of global capitalism. It destroys basically large part of Europe, for example. It loss of faith in European Union and in other parts of the world. And it's the beginning of what people have called the illiberal turn, meaning the resurgence of a series of nationalist, right-wing tendencies that sort of use the language of nationalism as a reaction to the potential crisis of capitalism. You see that in India with Modi, you see it in Europe with the increase of the rights wing everywhere, in Orban in Hungary, the Poland, Trump, if you want, in this country, Japan. In China, that happens too. There is a tightening down of if the more liberal aspects of Chinese society after 2009, and that becomes even more so after 2012, when a new leadership is installed, and the current leader, who is Xi Jinping, the current leader, who's basically has created a much stricter climate of repression, of surveillance, of control. If you went to China in the early 2000s, it wasn't, it was still an authoritarian country. There's not real democracy, but you didn't feel particularly under control all the time. The risk of doing things, intellectuals could talk more freely after 2009, especially after 2012, and especially in the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years. It's becoming much more difficult. It's becoming more difficult to do research. It's becoming more difficult to talk to people. It's getting worse. So, in this context, you have a shift on the US side as well. In the first evidence of the shift is under the Obama administration with the so-called pivot to Asia. Obama calls himself America's first Pacific president, and in 2011, I think they announced this pivot to Asia, meaning switching the attention from, the Middle East mostly, but other parts of the world to Asia as the center of future, present and future, both economic possibility, but also political confrontation. And from this point on, so before Trump, you see the steady increase and the steady assertion in the media, in the US media, but again, also in the Western media in general, of a discourse of China as the enemy. China becomes first, was first like a market, then it was a mass producer of goods, so a collaborator in global capitalism, then it becomes a competitor, then becomes a potential adversary, and now it's shaping into an enemy, and at times an existential enemy. And the existential part is because China is not just perceived or depicted as exactly a competitor, so somebody who is like Japan was in the in the 1980s, but not somebody who's doing the same thing as slightly better, or that's better in some fields and worse in some others. No, it's an existential enemy, existential threat, because China is depicted as proposing a model that is alternative to the model of capitalist liberal democracy. So China is proposing to the world, according to this view, a complete alternative. We are back, although without the communism and the socialism, we are back to the discourse of the old Cold War, in which China was the pathological alternative model. And now China is again the pathological alternative model. It's capitalism, but with authoritarianism. It's capitalism, but with no freedom. It's a system that it's integrated with us, but it's not really like us. So this is the discourse at this time. Now, I want to point out that there is a mirror discourse on the other side. The Chinese, especially under Xi Jinping, the Chinese government and the Chinese propaganda apparatus, especially under Xi Jinping, has steadily depicted themselves and depicted China not as an enemy, not as an adversary. They've been very clear that they're not. The rhetoric has been slightly, I would say, more peaceful than this side. But they are depicting themselves as an alternative. Not an alternative in the sense that they're going to substitute this model, but they steadily depict themselves as non-capitalist. So as different from Western capitalists. Now, I found that hilarious, but it doesn't matter. So they depict themselves as, the formulation is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Oh, I used to be socialism with market characteristic, but anyway, socialism with Chinese characteristic, which they state very clearly, it's not a it's not a capitalist. It's a capitalist model. It's not a capitalist system. So strangely, the rhetoric of the UN and the Western world has an echo in the rhetoric of the Chinese government. So basically, what happens is right now you have this discourse of the new Cold War, which recycles a lot of old Cold War tropes. You see China called easily like a socialist communist society, Marxist, whatever. Which it's strange because it glosses over and ignores how entangled China is into the global capitalist system. And that's a crucial difference from the old Cold War, which in a sense make the new Cold War even more dangerous. So in the old Cold War, the Soviet bloc and the communist bloc and the Western capitalist bloc had very little entanglement in terms of economies, for example. The Soviet bloc economy functioned kind of by itself. There were exchanges, but it functioned by itself. The Western economy didn't have very much connection with that. Right now, that's absolutely not the case. So this is based on a purely discursive fiction. You have to postulate that China is a different system, even if it's completely inserted in the same system, to call it an alternative moment. So when you act in the reality, you act in a reality in which the connection between these two countries are not between the two systems are completely integrated. My friend, sorry, that's another thing. My friend Isabella Weber is economist at Amherst, wrote this piece for The Guardian about the fantasy of decoupling, which is another word that is spoken today. People argue, well, okay, if China is an enemy, if China is an adversary, we have to decouple the two economies, because we cannot go to war with somebody which is so integrated. Well, that's, as Isabella pointed out, that's a pretty impressive and pretty difficult task, because as she writes, when we talk about decoupling, we talk about reorganizing the entire sector of production. I don't know if it happened to you, but if you order, for example, a MacBook, an Apple computer, a laptop, and you order not one of the standard one, you order one with specific, you want more memory, more something else. It doesn't come immediately. It usually comes after a few days, and it comes straight from Shanghai or Shenzhen or a place like that. And it comes directly with the package, they say, because your order went to the Foxconn factory, which is a Taiwanese company, by the way, in one of these places, where a bunch of migrant workers assemble your thing in a ready-to-made global supply chain, and eventually it gets to you in Dayton, Ohio. And to break this means reimagining the entire. This applies to Apple, but it applies to like an enormous amount of things. So to break this means to recreate the entire global supply chain of production and consumption. I mean, as Isabella mentioned, 54 of all phones worldwide are made in China. 40% of the tablets of computers and tablets. It's an enormous amount of the global economy, and that applies to China as well. So if the Chinese also are talking about decoupling, but they have the same problem, you really cannot do. So my point here is that when you hear these words of the new Cold War, you have to keep in mind a bunch of things. It is constructed on the ideological background of the old Cold War. It's constructed on a series of assumptions that were wrong at the time and are even more wrong now. That, like, when you're talking about China today, that has really nothing to do with, the old communist enemy. And I have plenty of bad things to say about the Chinese government, but this is not the way. But also, you have to think that this discourse is incredibly dangerous, because any Cold War can become a real war very quickly, or can produce wars very quickly. The old Cold War did not explode into a direct confrontation, but it produces an insane amount of smaller and very tragic wars. It also has effect on how we live today. The rise in anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism in this country is directly connected to this discourse. So that's a general introduction. Do I have time to, do you want me to talk about Hong Kong? I can talk about Hong Kong for a little bit. I want just to point out something else quickly. I'll do it. I'll try to do it in 10 minutes, and then I want to open for question. So the overall arching narrative of the Cold War that I mentioned also focuses to a specific point, as I say. One of the most contested one, for a bunch of reasons, is Hong Kong. Which, I have a little map here. That's a longer history than the one I just mentioned, because it started like a century earlier. It's a history that has to do with colonialism. Hong Kong became a British colony in 1842, and at the time it was just, I don't know if you can see it, this is the Hong Kong Island, and this is Kowloon, the peninsula. So just this part of Hong Kong was a colony. But then in 1898, the British government got this whole area here, which is called the New Territories, and China, as you can see, is here. They got it on a contract for 99 years. So 1898, 1997. Okay, that's an important date. Hong Kong during the British rule was ruled as a colony, and I mean as a colony in the most obvious sense. There was a dominant race and there was an inferior race. There was massive class division. The British had all the power. The native Chinese are none. There was colonial police, mostly done by Indian Sikh. And by the 1970s, Hong Kong became prosperous first as a manufacturing product. Made in Hong Kong was the old made in China, and then as a financial hub. So I'm simplifying a complicated and really bad colonial history, but fast forward to those 99 years after, 1997. In the 80s, there was an agreement between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher because that date was impending, and they decided that Hong Kong, sovereignty of Hong Kong would return to China, to the PRC, under a system that was called one country, two system. Meaning that the Hong Kong will belong territorially to the PRC, become integral part of the nation, but the capitalist system in Hong Kong and many of the regulation of Hong Kong and its particular form of rule will be maintained for at least 50 years. Yeah, you have a picture of the handover in 97. Now, the Brits did that funny thing before they left. They gave Hong Kongers a little bit of democracy. Just before they left, they instituted a system of semi-democratic elections. Semi-democratic because to this day, only half of the Legislative Council, the LegCo, is actually elected, and another half is chosen by business interest, to give you an idea who actually rules in Hong Kong. The chief executive is nominated by Beijing, but there is a fair amount of democratic participation. And to be fair, Hong Kongers took the democracy to heart. Hong Kong developed very quickly a very, very vibrant and very contentious civil society. The idea was, again, in the Western mind at the time, in the British, but also the Americans at the time thought, okay, we do this for 50 years and Hong Kong will transform China into its own image. China will become more like Hong Kong. It will become capitalist and therefore will become more open and therefore eventually it will become, a normal place. Not that Hong Kong is particularly a normal place. It didn't happen, of course. But what happened was that the economies of the PRC and Hong Kong got very closely integrated. Hong Kong became, and is to this day, the financial hub for Chinese capital. That's why it's so freaking important. And two things happened in Hong Kong. There was an influx of capital, so the wealth of the mainland got into Hong Kong, which with consequences for the real estate market. Hong Kong has a housing crisis that's horrible, and wealth, and so on and so forth. But also there was an influx of labor, of cheap labor from the mainland, which led to a rise of anti-Chinese racism. This was a poster that circulated in 2010, 2011. I was in Hong Kong at the time, and it's about Hong Kong, people from the mainland coming to Hong Kong to give birth so that their kids could have Hong Kong citizenship and therefore healthcare. And the picture is like locust, this giant locust, like a swarm of locusts coming into Hong Kong. It's really, the mainlanders would describe it as uncouth, as bugs and locusts, exactly. So it's not pretty. Things, were never fully settled, and there was over the years a push and pull between Beijing and Hong Kong to the degree of freedom that was allowed in Hong Kong. In the last few years, there were kidnapping of famous publisher who published, books that were not pleasant or positive towards the mainland. There's other books that are forbidden in China that can be published in Hong Kong and make their way to China. But things sort of precipitated massively last summer, summer 2019, when there were massive protests. The protests were originated by a particular law, which was called the extradition law, which had granted the Chinese government the ability to extradite anybody from Hong Kong and subject them to Chinese PRC tribunal. The law was slightly more complicated than that, but was seen as the sort of a massive step in encroaching the legal system of Hong Kong, a legacy of the British rule, and so on and so forth. The protests lasted for a long time. They involved a large amount of population, and they were incredibly complicated because they were massive. And so there were elements from the left, from the unions, from labor, really truly leftist part, but also really revanchist, racist, right-wing groups within this protest. So, for example, there were pro-Trump protesters with flags that were calling for Trump to liberate Hong Kong because Trump seemed to have a sort of more in-your-face attitudes toward the Chinese government. And they were, nostalgic of the British colonial rule. So again, positions that are largely untenable. The protests were eventually stopped by first the pandemic, but eventually by June 2020, the introduction of something called the National Security Law, which basically made any criticism of the PRC government a form of treason, and therefore made any protest technically impossible. The effect of the national security law are still difficult to measure because it's still unclear how draconianly it will be applied, but the signs are really not good. The question is, again, how do we relate through this series of events. I mean, in 2019, 2020, when the protests were going on, of course, I mean, I was in absolute support of people, protesting an encroachment over their liberties. But and there is an obvious need to support these people and support their right to govern themselves as they want. But there's also, as I say, plenty of blindness and plenty of contradiction within this movement, which is fine. The movements and contradiction. The problem is that these contradictions are often used unscrupulously by politicians in the US, for example, and outside the US. It's very difficult, for example, to reconcile nostalgia for the colonial rule for a real push for democracy, or it's very difficult to reconcile that with calling for direct US involvement. So you have a strange phenomenon at a certain point, to give you the extent of how contradictory it is of right-wing politicians in the US at the same time denouncing the Black Lives Matter protest, but exalting the Hong Kong protests, while Chinese politicians were doing the exact opposite. And I know you have an example here of Hua Chunying on Twitter, who is a spokesperson for the Chinese foreign minister, replying to somebody who was supporting the Hong Kong protest by typing "I can breathe," an obvious reference to the BLM movement and to how the police was suppressing American Black protesters. And Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam and the other mentioned there sort of criticize the West for the double standard in support of the BLM and in support of the BLM, but and also in support of the repressing the BLM and supporting of the Hong Kong movement, in which the violence of BLM was repressed, but or this perceived violence of the Black Lives Matter was excused for repression, but everything was allowed for the Hong Kong protest. I mean, all these people are in bad faith, of course. That's but I'm just pointing it out because you have events with a layered history, an incredible complex political situation to this day, which are used for within this rhetoric of the new Cold War to, the worst possible outcome, to favor the worst possible outcome, be it a trade war with China, Islamophobia, xenophobia, and things like that. So I want to leave some time for questions, but I can do the same thing for example, Xinjiang and other places. It's another very complicated thing. But I just want to point out exactly if it's anything you get for this is that the discourse on China is incredibly simplified of a very complicated situation, which has a layered, complex, and at times tragic history. Let me see if I can. Oh.
Thank you. So now, if anyone wants to ask questions, the floor is yours.
Hi, Dr. Lanza. I would like to ask you something.
Sure.
I am Connie Marquez, also from the History Department. I lived in Shanghai 4 years ago. For a short period of time, I got a teaching job there. And I found overwhelming, to say the least, the amount of control that Chinese state has. But my question is about current population in China. I mean, people who was born under this regime or has been used to this. Do you think they can potentially be allies to open up a little bit more China, or President Xi Jinping is completely, I mean, do you think things might change? My question is because I remember they control everything. They have this app, Alipay, in which they know how much you spend, at what time did you drink your coffee, and you cannot order anything without your phone and paying with that. So I was wondering, and I asked this to my friends in China, and they say, oh, it's perfect, it's just convenient. And I couldn't find anyone who says this is an invasion of your privacy. So I was thinking, is the floor set for this control? I mean, do you think these demands of some voices can potentially reach the population, or China will be like that?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question, and there are actually two questions at the same time. So I'll give you, I don't have a perfect answer. I'll give you an example of what happened recently. Just, it was like last week, I think. Yeah, last weekend, right? 2 weekends ago. There's this app called Clubhouse, which I don't know, you probably know. So Clubhouse was not banned in China yet. So what happened is that somebody opened a Clubhouse to discuss mostly the Xinjiang, the Uyghur Muslim problem. And at a certain point, there were 4,000 people, mostly from China, connected, speaking, crying, listening to Uyghurs talking at the Clubhouse for like 14 hours. Of course, the day after, China shut down the app, and so it's not available anymore unless you have a VPN and so. But it gives you the idea that there is, despite the amount of control, at least pockets of interest. The app, one of the app you mentioned, not Alipay, which pays for everything, but WeChat, Weixin, which is, and Weibo, which are also texting and sort of something between Twitter and Facebook. I've also found that they also have also this, like, you know, their way of expressing yourself. The government will shut you down eventually, but they find strange way to circulating information and things like that. So it's really, really difficult. I mean, like, it's really bad. The student protest of 3-4 years ago and the workers' protests were massively repressed. So it's really difficult to do something in China. But I'm not hopeless. I think that there is a certain amount of there is an enormous amount of control, but there is interest in other things. The second part is technology. That's a big thing because China is probably on the vanguard of some technological changes that eventually will affect us all. They're not specifically Chinese. They're just that China adopted them earlier for a bunch of reasons. And you can't live in China without your phone. It's impossible. It's just you can't buy anything. You can't just do anything. You just can't do it. So there is that for sure. That thing scares me slightly more because I think it's gonna come for all of us. It's already coming. You know, we are all tracked down by Alexa and Facebook and other things. But this is sort of more like granular, as you say. You know, you can't do anything, so they track you for everything. They track people during the pandemic because they say, oh, have you left? I say, no, never left, but your phone was, you know, there, so we track you down. We realize that you bought something there, so now you're staying in the house for like 2 weeks because you can't go out. Things like that. So yeah, again, double. I don't know. It's tricky. The technology scares me, but yeah. There is a question on the chat. Oh no, that's you ask an historian. How do you think that the US should address problems like Hong Kong, democracy protests, and the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in China from a foreign policy standpoint without pushing a new Cold War narrative? It's very difficult, but I think one of the first things to realize is that we are not living in separate world. So the case of Xinjiang is the most clear case. A colleague of mine, who's Darren Byler, who is a specialist of Xinjiang, wrote a book is coming out called Terror Capitalism, and it's about Xinjiang and how the development of torture, control, concentration camp in Xinjiang follow exactly the method and strategies used in Afghanistan and Iraq by the Bush administration, for example. Directly, it's not like my impression, they say so. They say we actually are let's model ourselves from the war on terror. But also introduce, like in Afghanistan and Iraq, introduce a way of monetizing terror to a system of technological control in particular way. So now, for example, China in Tibet and then in Xinjiang has experimented the technique of mass control through, an individual control through artificial intelligence that are not simply Chinese. They are actually with collaboration with Western company that wants to use them too. So I think the way of framing all these issues is that these issues are not simply that the China is doing something atrocious, which China is doing, but that something atrocious is also part and parcel of a larger problem, and that it's very difficult to speak of that problem unless you address it also in your own country. The Chinese are not. If you follow Chinese Twitter or some of the people who tweet on China, they will all the time tell you, hey, you guys, kids in cages, kids in cages, kids in cages. How can you tell them, like, well, yeah. So I will try to, it's much more complicated because you have to find a way to articulate a criticism that's also a self-criticism, and it's also a criticism that goes beyond national boundaries. You have to be equally critical, basically, of China and the rest and the US and other countries. It's difficult. My question is about, questions about the relevance of radical changes that took place after 2012. The changes after 2012 is the rise of nationalism, strictly climate repression. Oh no, it's not different than what's happened in China. Well, the question is, how is it different from what is happening in China today? Have those changes not endured? Yes, they have endured. So from 2012 to today, you have an increasingly sort of increasingly climate of repression, and I wonder what it's going to be after the pandemic. I have no idea. I'm curious to go back if I can and see what happens. So those changes have actually endured. One of my points is that those changes are not just Chinese. That the China follows the pattern of the rest of the world in this. It just, better. They are more efficient. But the liberal turn is visible, I think, pretty much everywhere else. Think of India. Think of Europe. It's Brazil. It's a serious shift, and it cannot be simply, given that that's happening globally, it cannot be simply that it's a Chinese thing. It is a Chinese thing, in the sense the Chinese thing has special characteristics, and that, because of the particular structure of the Communist Party and the particular economic power that China has, it has particular features, but it is part and parcel of a radical, I think, of a shift that affects us all in ways that we often don't realize. So in the sense, I think looking at China help us, if anything, to figure out what we are doing ourselves. Nothing good. Sorry, I don't want to be so pessimistic. I'm actually not that pessimistic. Anything else?
All right, then if not, I am going to end the recording here. But thank you again, Dr. Lanza.
Thank you. I mean, sorry to be bleak and depressing, but you know, I think keep your ears open when you alert when you hear the word China. It's not good.